Hello, folks. The last time we read, Dallas and Sari had gone off on their hike, and Tiller and Florida had gone off on their boat trip. And Tiller and Florida were having a terrible time. Their boat had crashed, and Florida ended up in the water, and she wasn't a good swimmer. And Dallas and Sari had gotten lost and found some boys who said that they'd watch their backpacks for them and they could get to a diner in a few minutes. And then those boys stole their backpacks, and um, so they were all just kind of feeling like it wasn't going very well. Chapter 54 is called Slow Motion. Tiller had been swimming toward Florida when his arms gave out. They were numb and heavy, and he felt crushing pressure against his chest. The water pulled him under, where everything seemed suddenly slow and quiet. Tiller tugged at his jacket as if that would release the weight against his chest. A simple, clear image floated through his mind. It was of him, diving into a river after his younger daughter, Rose, had gone under and hadn't surfaced. He found her sitting cross-legged on the bottom, holding her nose. Tiller snagged her arm and pulled her to the surface. "Aw, Daddy," she spluttered, "I almost broke my record." Now underwater, Rose blurred with Florida. He hoped Florida was holding her nose, and then he thought of Sari, and he wished he would go with her to search for her rocking bird. The last thought he had was about how he and Sari had had to keep one little secret from each other all those years. That Understone Fun secret, that silly secret. He felt he understood that now. Maybe keeping that secret would be protection in case something happened to the other person. Then the person remaining would have one thing left to grip onto. Or maybe it was because there might be times like now when if you knew everything about someone else, your heart would be too full and it might overflow. Chapter 55, On the Road. As Z drove Sari and Dallas away from the farm and down the bumpy road, he felt jittery. They had to find Tiller in Florida quick. Sari and Dallas had made that clear. Z thought it perfectly reasonable that they had sensed that Tiller and Florida were in trouble. The mind worked in strange ways, he believed. Z kept stealing glances at Dallas. "He doesn't look anything like me," Z thought. "Fortunate for him. I'm an ugly son of a gun." "What do you think, Z?" Sari said. "How are we going to gauge where they might be on the river?" "Not sure," Z said. "We're going to go with our gut feelings." He sped over the bumpy road and careened out onto the highway. "I should have shaved," he thought. "I should have changed clothes. That kid must think I'm a bum." "There's something I ought to tell you," Z said, "about that Trepid fellow." "He stole the Understone funds," Dallas blurted. "He's been down in the holler poking around and—" "Dallas, what on earth would put that in your head?" Sari said. "Well, he ain't far off," Z said. "He's a mighty smart cookie. He must have some of that extrasensory whatever, reading people's minds and such." "Huh?" Sari said. "What's going on?" So Z filled him in on how Mr. Trepid had asked him to check out the holler and find any special stones and make a map. "So you think he's looking for our Understone funds?" Sari asked. "Yep. How on earth would he have heard about our Understone funds? I can't for the life of me imagine who could have told him. I know you wouldn't tell him, Z." "You got that right," Z said. Dallas opened his mouth, closed it again, and then opened it again. "I've got a little confession, though," Z said. "I took your funds for safekeeping." "How'd you find 'em?" Dallas said. "I've got a nose for buried things, I guess," Z said. "Don't worry, Sari, it's all safe." "I'm not worried," she said. "Not about that." "Got the 2 metal boxes," Z said, "and the loose money in those other 2 holes." "What other 2 holes?" Sari asked. "Probably mine and Florida's," Dallas said. Sari touched Dallas's hand. "You mean you 2 have your own Understone funds, just like me and Tiller?" A little sound like a stifled sob came from her mouth. "That's so sweet," she said. Dallas felt terrible. He wished he could disappear into the seat. Not only was he feeling guilty about having told Mr. Trepid about the Understone funds, but he feared they wouldn't find Florida and Tiller, or that if they found them, they might be dead. Instantly, his mind moved elsewhere, to the holler, to the cabin, to the loft, to the bed with its soft quilts. "So, is that Trepid fellow still going to be nosing around the holler?" Sari asked. "Good questions," he said. Dallas studied Sari. He knew she was worried as he was about Tiller in Florida because of the way she was wringing that yellow scarf in her hands and staring intently at the road ahead, as if staring would get them there faster. Dallas turned to look at Z, who maneuvered his truck around the curves as if he were an expert race car driver. You know that Kangadoon place, Z said? I've been doing some asking around. I found a guy who's been there. It was hard for Dallas to keep his mind on the conversation. Why was Z chattering away about Kangadoon? Why wasn't he coming up with a plan to find Tiller in Florida? So, what'd that guy say about Kangadoon? Sari asked. Dallas wanted to scream, "Shut up about Kangadoon!" Z slapped at the dashboard. He got eaten nearly alive by mosquitoes. Came home with malaria. Malaria, Sari said. Yep. Z swerved off the main road and down a narrower one. This here road goes to the Mackalac River, he said. That's where my gut's telling me to go. What are your guts telling you? Dallas pressed his hand against his stomach and closed his eyes. Mackalac, he said. Sounds right to me. Chapter 56, On the River. With the help of her one-log raft, Florida had made her way to the bank and crawled up its muddy side. She lay there for a minute, trying to catch her breath, and then she sat up and scanned the water. She was feeling a little mad at Tiller that he hadn't rescued her. Florida spotted the boat stuck in the mud upstream on the same side of the river. She saw one life jacket bobbing against the opposite bank. "Tiller!" she shouted. She saw a flash of color upstream near a boulder. Tiller's jacket? Then she saw his head bob up and go back down. She raced upstream and tugged at the boat, flipping it over. No paddles. She saw Tiller's jacket and head bob up again and go down. She hurried to untie the tent ropes from the struts and then tied one end to a tree on the bank. Holding the other end in her hand, she waded back into the water. "Tiller!" she shouted. "I'm coming! I'm coming through this putrid, stupid river. I'm probably going to die doing it, but I'm coming. I hope you appreciate this." The water pushed at her, whirling and swirling around her knees and then her waist and her chest. Knocked and dragged by the current, Florida held tight to the rope, her eyes fixed on flashes of Tiller's jacket, which ballooned up out of the river and skittered in the air before settling back down again. "Listen, River," she said as she inched along the river bottom. I'll make you a deal. You let up on me, and I'll. But she couldn't think of what bargain she could make with the river. "Sweet River," she tried. "Beautiful River," but the water surged at her, knocking her under. She pulled herself upright with the rope. "Cruddy, scummy, pea-brained River." Tiller's jacket billowed up again, and she lunged, snagging the jacket and pulling it toward her. She grabbed Tiller's arm, wrapped the rope around it, and fished under the water for his head. When she saw his face, she wanted to bust out crying. "Oh, man, Tiller, you're not looking so good. You're looking purely dead." She dragged him to the bank and rolled him on his stomach and mashed on his back. She wished she'd pay more attention in health class when that nurse had come with the rubber dummy and showed him how to do that artificial perspiration stuff. A splurt of water gushed from Tiller's mouth. Florida rolled him onto his side and probed her finger in his mouth to see if anything was stuck in there. All the while she was shouting at him, "Tiller! Tiller, you hear me? You breathing? I don't want to have to do that breathing stuff. I don't know how. I don't remember." She pinched Tiller's nose and thought of Dallas trying to breathe air into Joey's. As she was about to breathe into Tiller's mouth, his eyes opened. "I sure hope that means you're alive," she said. "I hope you're not going to putrid die on me." Tiller raised one hand and placed it against his chest, patting it. "My heart's feeling soggy," he said. "Get help." His eyes closed again. "Well, where am I supposed to get help?" she said. "Wake up! Don't you putrid die!" She scanned the banks, and then she shouted the only thing that she could think to shout. "Dallas! Dallas!" Z and Sari and Dallas, who were downstream searching the banks, heard her. When Florida saw him running toward her, she felt as if she would break apart into a zillion pieces, and all of those pieces would scatter into the air and disappear into the clouds. Chapter 57, The Soggy Heart. Florida was in the hospital waiting room, wrapped in a blanket. Beside her were Dallas and Z. "I'm just glad you were there, Florida," Sari had said before she hurried down the hall with the doctor. "I'm so eternally grateful for that. But I'm also sorry you were there. Sorry you had to be so scared." Florida tucked her chin inside the blanket to try to stop its quivering. "How come we have to wait so long?" Dallas asked. "When are they going to tell us if Tiller will make it?" Z sat up straighter. "The boy is asking me a question. The boy is relying on me." "I'll go ask at the desk," Z said, trying to sound as if he knew what he was doing. Dallas inched closer to Florida. "It'll be okay. I know it. Don't be worrying, Florida. Nothing can happen to Tiller." Florida's chin dipped lower into the blanket. She hadn't known she could worry so much about somebody other than Dallas. She wanted to run down the hall and bang on all the doors until she found Tiller. And then she wanted to make him feel better and hear him talk again with his grumpy way and see his grin when he made a joke and watch him flip pancakes and talk about secret recipes. Z returned, awkwardly shuffling his feet, his hands hanging helplessly by his sides. They don't know much yet, he said. Z stuffed his hands in his pockets and then pulled them out again. Hospitals make me a little crazy. I'm going to go find us some donuts. And with that, he hurried from the room. Kind of a strange guy, that Z, Dallas said. Florida, spotting Sari coming toward him, leapt up and raced toward her. She buried her head against Sari, wrapping her arms tightly around her. Maggoty river, she said. It's okay, Sari said, stroking Florida's hair. I think our Tiller's going to make it. Chapter 58, Preparations. Z and Dallas and Florida were in the kitchen with Sari. Bowls and measuring cups and ingredients covered the counters. Flour and sugar dusted their clothes. Sari, you should see the gop we got, Florida said. Tell her, Dallas, tell her all about our gunk. We've got mousetraps and lizards and worms and thumbtacks and nettles and, Florida jumped in, poison ivy and mashed blackberries and a dead mouse. Found the putrid dead mouse by the barn. As soon as we do our digging, Sari said, I'll go back to the hospital. Tiller will be sorry he missed this, though. His heart attack is over, though, right? Florida said. It was only a little one, right? He'll be fine, Sari said. He's already grumbling, so I know he'll be just fine. We might be able to bring him home today. Z sniffed the air. What are you cooking? Be nice to orphans brownies, Sari said. Might not work, but what the heck? Worth a try. Outside, they dug beneath the marked stones and inserted the brownies in one hole. And the mouse traps and lizards and worms and thumbtacks and nettles and poison ivy and mashed blackberries and dead mouse in the other holes. Now, for the final ones, he said. Picked these up at Venny's Variety, just like Dallas suggested. He held out a bag to show him. The previous night, after Z had left Ruby Holler, he drove into Boxton. In the alley, he saw Mr. Trepid scooting back and forth, peering out in the black night. Z passed him a folded piece of paper. Took longer than I expected, Z said. Lot of territory up there. Lots of stones. Mr. Trepid hurriedly unfolded the paper and aimed a flashlight at it. Ah, he said. And my. He studied the paper. Still seems like a lot of sights. Like I said, there's a lot of stones up there. I tried to narrow it down like you said. Z leaned against the shack and gazed out into the night. So, what's next? Mr. Trepid flicked off the flashlight. I'll take care of it from here on. Your work is done. What about the additional salaries? Z asked. Like I said, if this produces results, you'll get your bonus. And when are you likely to know if there's any results? When did you say they're coming back? Trepid asked. About a week, as far as I can gather, Z lied. I'd better get busy then, Trepid said. I should know the results before they get back. If you're going up there, I'd say Sunday would be the best, just to be on the safe side. Fine, Trepid said, motioning Z away. Off with you then. I've got things to do. Things to do. Later, alone in the shack, Mr. Trepid studied a map, a treasure map. He could hardly contain himself. Leaning against the table was a shovel. On the table was a trowel and a sturdy empty sack. Mr. Trepid rubbed his hands together. A treasure map for Ruby Holler. Chapter 59 is called Investments. Mrs. Trepid was furious. What do you mean you'll be away all day? She asked her husband. What am I supposed to do with all those kids once they get back from Sunday school? You know Morgan's off this morning. I can't manage all these rowdy kids all by myself. Mr. Trepid rummaged in the closet until he found his old boots. I told you this is important, he said. It concerns the investments. Where would you be going dressed like that, in that old bowling shirt and those dirty boots? This doesn't look like investment checking clothing to me. Mr. Trepid scurried past her to a chair where he sat and stuffed his feet into the boots. Do that outside, Mrs. Trepid said. You're getting dried up old mud on the carpet, just like the kids. He ignored her, lacing his boots and scooting over to the closet again. You didn't answer me, Mrs. Trepid said. How am I supposed to manage all these kids on my own, and where are you going dressed like that? He turned and smiled sweetly at her. I'm sure you can manage one day on your own. And as for where I'm going, you needn't worry your pretty little head about that, he said. Mrs. Trippett hated whenever he referred to her pretty little head, made her feel like a stupid little doll thing. My pretty little head, she said icily, would just like to know where you are going. My pretty little head doesn't think that that's too much to ask of her husband. There's one thing about his wife that Mr. Trippett particularly disliked. When she wanted to know something, she would hammer him to death with questions until he answered her. I'm checking on some land investments, he said, so I need to go look at the land. The land is out in the country. If these investments come through, we won't have to clean up after these kids anymore. We'll go to an island in the deep blue sea. There, is your pretty little head satisfied with that? Mrs. Trippett didn't answer him. She was looking at herself in the mirror, remembering the pale blue silk dress with the pink flowers and the gold necklace with the rubies and the opals. Chapter 60, Hospital Talk. Sari was seated in the chair beside Tiller's hospital bed. I want to get out of here, Tiller grumbled. I feel fine. Don't like being cooped up like this. I want my creaky swing and my lopsided porch. I don't want anybody poking around in here. He tapped at his chest, cutting me open and messing around with things. You sure are grumpy, Sari said. The doctor said you don't need that bypass operation after all. With a little rest and watching your diet, you'll feel like a new man in no time. Bypass makes me sound like a road, and I don't want to be a new man. I want to be the old me. The old crotchety boot I know so well, Sari said. The handsome old crotchety boot. They'd been talking most of the afternoon, full up to the top of their heads with things to say, and what they had to say wasn't about each other, or about their trips, or even about heart attacks or bypass operations. It was about the Hoppers and the Cranbecks and the Bergertons and the Dreeps and the Treppids and the Boxton Creek home. We can't let Dallas and Florida go back to that place, Sari said. I know it, Tiller said. Those Treppid people shouldn't be running a home for kids. I know it. Tiller, I love those two kids. I love them to pieces, just like they're our own kids. I know it. Z said there are about a dozen kids in that home, Sari said. Poor things. It's a crime. You think they're all feeling as jittery as Dallas and Florida were when they came here? Remember how they thought we were going to make them sleep in a hog pen? Or was it a snake pit? I just can't hardly bear to part with those two, Sari said. I know it. And Tiller, I love the Holler too. I just want you to know that. I know it. And Tiller, without you, I'm just a sock without a boot. I know it. He gazed at Sari. Do you want me to say all those nice things back to you? No, she said, tapping his chest. I know it all. Good. So, Sari said, you got any ideas? Can you think of any way to keep Dallas and Florida in the Holler? I'll sleep on it, he said. I'll sleep on it real good. Tiller leaned back, closed his eyes, and quickly opened them again. Hey, he said, I just remembered something. When Z was in here, he said there was something he wanted to discuss with me after I got home. What do you think that's all about? Sari yawned. Oh, probably nothing important. You know what he asked me? If I remembered what year his wife left. I told him I hadn't the foggiest recollection. Now take a nap while we wait for the doctor to set you free. You need to rest up. Buddy and Lucy are arriving on Monday. Oh, they don't need to come all the way down here, Tiller said. Makes me nervous, kids gathering around like that, like they think I'm going to kick the bucket. And we've got the little Trepid adventure tomorrow, don't forget. Trepid? That putrid... Tiller pushed the covers aside and swung his feet over the bed. No time for napping. Where are my clothes? Where's that doctor? Get me out of here. Chapter 61, Mr. Trepid's Adventure. On Sunday, Mr. Trepid turned off the main highway and drove down the narrower road and then onto a bumpy dirt road which led into Ruby Holler. He didn't see how anybody could live out here. Bumpy roads and no signs and no stores and no gas stations. What did a person do if he ran out of gas? What if he got hungry? As his car clunked and bumped along, Mr. Trepid thought about the red Cadillac convertible. He imagined himself driving along on a day such as this with the top down, his arm along the door and the wind breezing by. He glanced over at where his wife would be sitting, her head leaned back against the seat, the wind blowing her hair. She wouldn't be peppering him with questions. No, she'd be smiling to herself, happy to be riding along in a red Cadillac convertible with her husband. That old couple who lived up in the Holler, what did they need so much money for? If they were stupid enough to bury it in a hole, he thought, then they're practically begging for somebody to come find it and take it. If a person like himself was just out digging on a hillside and happened to find something, it was his, right? Finders keepers. When he reached the end of the dirt road, Mr. Trepid got out of the car and retrieved his shovel, trowel, and a sack from the trunk. He patted his shirt pocket just to be sure the map was still there and set off down the path. When he found the cabin, he studied the map, paced 20 feet away from the cabin, and spotted the first pile of stones. Quickly, he moved the rocks aside and plunged the trowel into the dirt. In the barn loft, Dallas aimed his binoculars at Mr. Trepid. Florida aimed a camera, and Sari and Tiller kneeled behind them. Z was perched in a tree near the bare bush. 2 hours later, Mr. Trepid was spitting mad. Dotted across the hillside were the remains of his digging efforts, stones and dirt cast aside in sloppy heaps. It looked as if a crowd of moles had engaged in a burrowing frenzy. He hadn't yet found the piles of money he was looking for, but he had unearthed some strange things. One was a packet of brownies. He'd tentatively tasted one. Not bad, he thought, but why are they burying food? Are they crazy? In one hole, he'd found only a tangle of leaves and berries. In another, a mousetrap, which snapped on his thumb. He'd plunged his hand into a pile of stinging nettles in one hole, and into a clump of mashed blackberries wrapped deceptively in a leather pouch in another hole. He was nursing a dozen tiny thumbtack pricks and a peculiar rash creeping up his arm. When Mr. Trepid lifted one of those more promising-looking stones, 3 lizards raced across his boots, and one darted up his pant leg. Without thinking, he smashed the shovel against his leg. The lizard fell out, stunned, but now his leg was sore and bruised. It was pretty much the last straw for Mr. Trepid. Those conniving people, he thought, they've purposely put this stuff here to mislead anybody who might come looking. He studied the map. He'd investigated all but one of the holes, and wondered if he should give up and go home. Who knew what might be under that last pile of stones? Maybe a poisonous snake. Maybe something worse. Mr. Trepid made his way to the last stone marked on the map, kicking dirt clogs ahead of him and smashing his shovel into trees. When he reached the stone, he knelt down. This one had tiny black swirly lines on it. Maybe a code. He tapped at the stone with his shovel, debating whether or not to move and dig underneath. Oh, well, he thought, it's the last one. I might as well try. I've got to find that money. I can't go home empty-handed. The shovel snagged what appeared to be a length of cord. He snatched at it, releasing a pouch from the dirt. Here we go again. Probably some stupid food. Nudging the sack with the toe of his boot, he felt something hard inside. He nudged again. Many hard little things. Marbles, maybe? Pebbles? He probed at the opening of the pouch with a stick, loosening it. Carefully, he took hold of the bottom of the pouch and tipped its contents onto the ground. Yes, he thought, payday. He could hardly believe his eyes. Chapter 62 is called Jewels. Mr. and Mrs. Trepid sat on the edge of their bed, staring at the contents of the pouch, which Mr. Trepid had emptied on the bedspread. Look at that, Mr. Trepid said, scratching fiercely at the rash spreading up his arms. Look at all those jewels. Mrs. Trepid reached out tentatively, touching one of the red ones. Rubies, she said. Mr. Trepid gathered a handful of stones and let them fall back on the bedspread, where they scattered like colorful raindrops. Rubies and emeralds and diamonds. But are you sure? She said. Mr. Trepid laughed, dizzy with excitement. What else could they be? But I thought you said, wasn't it a land investment you mentioned? Look what I found in the land, he said. We're rich. We're bazillionaires. He scratched at his neck. This stupid rash. Mrs. Trepid felt faint. She picked up one of the rubies, turning it around in her hand. It's so smooth, she said. A knock at their door was followed by Morgan saying, Ma'am, it's me, Chief Gopher. Quick, Mr. Trepid said, pulling the covers over the jewels. Hide these. Ma'am, Morgan called, the baby's dressed. What do you want me to do with her? Mrs. Trepid went to the door and opened it a crack. Just take care of her, Morgan. We have some important business to do. She closed the door and said to her husband, Well, what now? How do you turn those jewels into money? Mr. Trepid had been thinking about that. He'd go to the jewelers, to a place where he looked at that $9,000 watch. He'd take a few of the gems and see if the jeweler could give him an estimate of their worth. Won't he be surprised, Mr. Trepid thought. Wait till he sees what we have. To his wife, Mr. Trepid said, I'll be taking these in for appraisal. Do you think, may I keep one of those, she asked. Mr. Trepid beamed. "But of course," he said generously. He selected a ruby and placed it in her hand. "For you, a ruby." He gathered up 2 more stones and dropped them one by one into her open palm. "And an emerald and a diamond." The 3 gems sparkled in her hand. A ruby, an emerald, a diamond. "Where'd those brownies come from?" she asked. "Oh, I stopped at a bake sale on the way home," he lied. "They're not bad. Try one." As Mrs. Trepid nibbled at a brownie, she heard shouting and the sounds of many feet trampling down the hallway. "And that island you mentioned," she said to Mr. Trepid. "How soon do you think?" "As soon as possible," Mr. Trepid said. "I can smell the sea breeze already." He rubbed furiously at his cheek. "You got any lotion? I must have picked up something out there in the country. It's driving me crazy." Chapter 63 is called Mission Accomplished Cake. Tiller, Sari, Dallas, Florida, and Z were in the cabin kitchen, all tossing ingredients into a big red bowl. "This is our mission accomplished cake," Sari said. "Needs lots of good stuff in it," Tiller said. "You see anything you want to add? Dump it in." Florida added chocolate syrup. Boy, that Mr. Trepid was hopping mad when he found those lizards. Dallas drizzled some honey into the bowl. "And what about when that mousetrap snapped? Man, I could hear him swearing all the way up in the barn." "Can't wait to get those pictures developed," Z said, "especially the one of him with the jewels." "Jewels," Sari said. "What a foolish man." "How much did those stones cost?" Tiller asked. "Got the whole bag for $1.99. Z dropped a handful of pecans into the bowl. "I do feel a tiny bit bad for Mr. Trepid," Sari said. "Don't you go feeling sorry for him," Florida said. "He would have stolen all your money if he'd had the chance." "Putrid pincher," Tiller said, adding more chocolate syrup to the bowl. Z tossed a handful of chopped cherries into the mix. "What about your trips? Your real trips? Guess you're not going on those, right?" "Tiller and I were talking about that earlier," Sari said. "It seems we won't be going off on those trips after all. It seems we'll stay right here in the holler." She turned to Florida and Dallas. "I hope you kids aren't going to be too disappointed about that." Dallas spotted a jar of peanuts, opened it, and dumped them into the bowl. He didn't know what to think. Part of him was relieved, and part of him wanted to bawl his head off. "I guess I'd better head out and pick up Buddy and Lucy at the airport," Z said. "Be good to have your own kids home, won't it?" Sari and Tiller nodded. "It will," they said. Florida emptied the jar of chocolate syrup into the bowl. She reached across the counter for a bag of cookies, smashed the whole bag with the empty jar, and then emptied the smashed cookies into the bowl. Sari cupped Florida's chin in her hands. "Honey," Sari said, "don't you ever let anybody treat you bad ever again. You hear me?" "Sure," Florida thought. "Easy for you to say when you're about to get rid of us." She pounded the dough with a wooden spoon. Chapter 64 is called Appraisals. Once again, Mr. Trepid had parked his battered old car several blocks from the Cadillac showroom. He'd worn his best suit, unaware that a piece of bubble gum was stuck to the back of his jacket and that a cornflake crumbs clung to his pants legs. The salesman who'd waited on him before met him just inside the door. "Mr. Trepid, correct?" He shook Mr. Trepid's hand, but noticing the red rash on Mr. Trepid's hand and wrist, the salesman cut short the handshake. "The red Cadillac convertible, is that the one you're still interested in?" The salesman noticed the tiny blisters on Mr. Trepid's face and neck. "That's right," Mr. Trepid said, rubbing at the skin beneath his jacket. "I just want to be sure it will be available." "Oh," the salesman said, "you've made your decision?" "Yes," Mr. Trepid said, pawing at his ear. "I'm off to make some arrangements, and then I'll be back. How soon could I have it?" "Do you care to discuss the finances?" No, not now. It'll be fine, I'm sure. I suppose I ought to take it for a test drive. Is that possible?" "Absolutely," the salesman said. He didn't think he should mention the gum on Mr. Trepid's jacket or the crumbs on his pants. The salesman figured that if a man wanted to buy a new Cadillac, he could have food all over himself if he wanted. Mr. Trepid parked the Cadillac directly in front of First Avenue Jewelry Store. The ding of the door's bell brought the salesman from the back of the store. "Ah," he said, "Mr. Trepid, I believe." As Mr. Trepid approached, the salesman noticed the angry rash creeping up Mr. Trepid's neck and across his face, and the salesman took a step backward. He hoped that whatever Mr. Trepid had wasn't contagious. "The watch I was looking at. You remember which one?" Mr. Trepid said. "Yes, sir, I do," the salesman said. Would the gentleman like to see it again?" "No, just checking. I wonder if you also do appraisals." "Appraisals? Of jewelry?" "Yes, or gems. Precious jewels." Mr. Trepid retrieved the pouch from his pocket and laid it carefully on the counter. I have here some gems that I'd like appraised. The man eyed the pouch. I'd be happy to do appraisals for you. What sort of gems? Mr. Trepid raked at his neck. This blasted rash. Rubies, he said, and emeralds and diamonds. Rubies and emeralds and diamonds? May I? The salesman extended his hand. Mr. Trepid smiled as he carefully undid the pouch and poured the gems into the salesman's hand. The salesman stared at the stones and cleared his throat. Perhaps you would like to leave them with me, he said. I'll need to consult my manager. Fine, whatever, Mr. Trepid said. When do you think you can give me a firm appraisal? The salesman dumped the stones back into the pouch. Oh, I'd say by tomorrow, no problem. And my gems are safe here with you, Mr. Trepid said. The salesman chewed on his lips. Oh, yes, they're perfectly safe with me. Fine, very good then, Mr. Trepid said. As Mr. Trepid drove away, the salesman called to someone in the back room. Hey, get in here. Wait till you see what this joker wants appraised. A bunch of worthless dime store stones. Chapter 65. Conversations in the Night. It was a cool night in the holler, with a lazy breeze blowing through, whisking branches against the loft window. Dallas whispered to Florida, Listen, you hear Tiller snoring? And you can hear Sari and her kids down there. They're still talking. Don't they know we can hear them? Florida said. She was hidden under her quilt with only her head poking out, staring at Buddy's and Lucy's suitcases sitting on the 2 empty beds. Tiller and Sari seem pretty happy to have their kids here, don't they? Dallas said. Don't worry about it. They're probably sorry we're taking up space. Or don't talk about it. They're probably sorry we're taking up space up here. Did you hear what Buddy said when he saw us? He said, Who are those 2 kids? Like we were a couple of dogs. He didn't mean it like that, Dallas said. Florida had also heard Lucy ask her parents what on earth those 2 kids were doing here. And what on earth had Tiller and Sari been thinking anyway, taking on a couple of stray kids that they didn't know anything about? Florida could hear Lucy's voice now below, rising as if she were annoyed. You can't possibly keep them here now, Lucy said. What with Dad recuperating and... Shh, Sari said. Lower your voice, please. But, Mom, Lucy said. Let's go outside, Sari said. Florida heard the screen door close and then turned to Dallas. We're just in the way, she said. I thought Tiller and Sari were different from all the rest of those terrible grown-ups, but they're not. Stop it, Dallas said. They are different. Don't you go talking bad about them. I can say whatever I want to, she said. She thought about Tiller's lying in his bed downstairs. What was Tiller dreaming? What if his heart started hurting again? Dallas was out of bed, rummaging around. What are you doing? Florida said. What are you stuffing in that sack? I'm packing. Don't do that, Florida said. Why not? Maybe you're right. Maybe our time is up here. They don't need us. We're just in the way, aren't we? Dallas put a change of clothes in the sack and then pulled them out again. What's ours and what's theirs? Is this shirt mine? Of course it's yours, Dallas. Who else's would it be? I mean, did they buy it or did I have it already when we came here? Let me see it, Florida said. Dallas tossed the shirt at her. You don't have to be so rough, she said, examining the shirt. It's a nice one. Definitely not one you had when we came here. She tossed it back to Dallas, who threw it on the floor. Reluctantly, Florida eased out from under the quilt. I guess I've got to pack too, she said. I guess you do, Dallas said, unless you're not coming with me. What are you talking about? You wouldn't go without me, would you? Dallas sat back down on his bed. No, I wouldn't do that. Not if you wanted to come. But maybe you don't want to come. Maybe that night freight train doesn't sound so good to you anymore. It sounds good. It sounds just fine. I'm just tired is all. I thought we'd be resting up for a few days, Florida said. She was surprised at how much she didn't want to leave. No point resting up, Dallas said. We might as well get moving. Are you talking about tonight? Florida asked. You mean like this night here, right now? That's what I mean, Dallas said, after Lucy and Buddy are asleep. What about saying goodbye? We're not even going to say goodbye? It was nearly midnight when Lucy and Buddy crept up to the loft. Sari crawled into bed beside Tiller. She studied his face and listened to his even breathing. She sat leaning against the headboard, knowing she would have trouble sleeping. She'd been surprised when Lucy and Buddy suggested that Dallas and Florida should be sent back to the home right away. Could this be her own Lucy? Her own Buddy, so cold and unfeeling? Then Sari told Buddy and Lucy about the Trepids and about the Hoppers and the Crandeps and the Burgertons and the Dreeps. She told him about Florida and Tiller fixing up the old boat, and about Dallas helping her plan her trip and get supplies, and about how the kids had run through the holler and climbed its trees. "Oh, Mom," Lucy had said when she finished, "they must love the holler just like we did. I dream of it all the time, and to be back here now." Buddy was sitting on the porch swing, taking in the view. "What a place this is! What a place!" He took hold of Sary's hand. "But are you sure you can manage 2 kids right now? And are you sure you can handle something else to worry about?" "Worry about," Sary had said. "Those 2 keep us from worrying. They're a comfort." But now, as she lay in bed, she wondered if she was selfish to want Dallas and Florida to stay. What was the best thing for them? Certainly it wasn't going back to the home. She was sure of that. And those kids loved the holler. They loved being able to run and shout. They loved the stream and the trees and the birds. She wanted to wake Tiller so that he could reassure her. In the hospital, he had said one of the first things he was going to do when he'd rested up was teach Dallas how to chop wood and light the lanterns. And he'd go fishing with Florida and teach her how to swim. She heard Buddy and Lucy climb into their beds above, and then it was quiet, with only the wind brushing the branches against the house. "Good night, Tiller," she whispered. "Good night, my handsome old boot." Florida heard Dallas slip out of bed. What she really wanted to do was stay under her quilt and drift off to sleep and wake up to the smell of bacon and eggs and waffles and syrup and honey and blueberries and everything sweet and warm that you could possibly think of to eat. "It's time," Dallas whispered. "What's that, a note?" "Yeah, I'll leave it on the bureau. I'm leaving that carving, too." "The leafy tree one? Okay, I'll leave mine, too." "What is it?" "A curly-headed bat." She knew that bats didn't really have curly heads, but that's how this one came out. And bats were good. Tiller said so. She watched Dallas stuff his old socks into his sack. "Hey, Dallas, whatever happened to your backpack and your sleeping bag?" "Lost 'em," he said, thinking about the 2 boys who had offered to watch his and Sary's gear, making maybe the gear was still there. Maybe he could find his way back. "You ready?" Florida asked, interrupting his thoughts. "What? Oh, yeah. Okay, I'm ready." They slipped down the ladder and out the door. "Okay," Dallas said, trying to sound more cheerful than he felt. "Let's catch that night train and ride on out of town." They just stepped off the porch when Florida said, "Hey, wait, what about our money?" "Shoot, Z's got it, remember? I guess we could try and find his place and ask him for our money." "Forget it," Florida said. "We've got no dang idea where his place is. Money is trouble, Dallas. I don't want it." Dallas thought about all the food their money could buy, and his stomach rumbled in response. Maybe they should wait another day and get their money from Z. But they went outside, and there they were on their way, and they kept their feet moving forward. Across the holler, Z was in his own cabin, holding a lantern in the middle of the main room. What a pit. Maybe I ought to start cleaning. Maybe I ought to get some groceries. Maybe I ought to... But he didn't do anything except flop down on his bed and go to sleep. Chapter 66 is called Dreams. When there's a full moon in Ruby Holler, as there was on the night that Dallas and Florida left the cabin, the purest silver light makes everything above and below look soft and rich like velvet. The birds sit quietly in the trees, and all the other creatures seem to move more gently, as if their feet were padded with cotton. "Good smell here," Florida said as they picked their way along beside the barn. "Good old barn, too." Dallas leaned forward to smell the wood siding. "Let's follow the creek a ways," he said. They wound their way down the hill and moved slowly along the bank, picking their way over stones and around bushes until Florida said, "Wait, stop." "What's the matter?" "I don't want to leave," Florida said. "I like it here. Nobody ever treated us this good before, and nobody's probably ever going to treat us this good again." "But like you said, maybe we're in the way now. We don't have any choice, do we?" Dallas said. "Who's going to chop the wood while Tiller's getting his strength back?" Florida said. "And who's going to haul the water?" Dallas saw himself, pioneer boy, chopping wood and hauling water. He saw himself stalking through the woods. "And," Florida said, "who's going to help Sary with all those getting over heart attack things that she's going to have to make? Answer me that." Dallas stood there thinking. "I believe I'm getting a little idea," he said. "Are you getting an idea?" "Yep," she said. Dallas glanced around. Whoa! He moved toward a tree near the bank, a tall one with long leafy branches dipping down toward the ground. "In here," he said, dipping under the branches. "It's like a fort or something," Florida said. "I've had a dream about this place," Dallas said. "Honest, it was this exact place. This leafy tree with the branches hanging down and the creek nearby, what an odd thing that it's a real place. Dallas, let's camp here, okay? You mean camp here and see what happens. Florida spread out her sleeping bag and crawled inside. You gonna be okay without a sleeping bag, Dallas? Yeah, he said. I've got this sack for a pillow. Maybe the crawly things will leave me alone for one night. Dallas, are you hoping what I'm hoping? Maybe, he said. Let's not say it out loud, though. And so they slept. And as they slept, they dreamed again of talking birds. Florida was paddling down the river on a raft when a meteor crossed the sky, filling it with golden light. And out of the golden light came a golden bird, which swept down to Florida's raft. It said, "You're my baby." And Florida put out her hand to the bird and said, "Okay." In Dallas's dream, he crawled out from beneath the leafy tree and stood by the edge of the clear stream. Soon a silver bird fluttered down from the sky and sat on his shoulder. "There's a place where you can go where everything is." "Is what?" Dallas said. "Where everything is magic," the bird said. Dallas touched his silver feathers. "And that place is—" But the bird merely tucked his head in his wing and fell asleep. In the morning, Dallas heard birds calling and knew it was first light, but he didn't open his eyes. He held very still, afraid to breathe. Florida, too, heard the birds. "Oh, please," she prayed, "please." She scrambled out of her sleeping bag, breathed deeply. "Dallas, wake up," she called. Dallas lifted his head and glanced at Florida. "Dallas, take a whiff. What's that you smell?" He inhaled. It was the best smell in the world. Bacon. Welcome home, bacon. The end.